Okay, my name's Austin Williams. I'm from the Future Cities Project, and this session is called Climate Emergency, Catastrophe, or Catastrophizing. It's a huge topic, so we're never going to cover everything. But I just took a quick look before we started on some of the issues that have come up in the press in the recent weeks. One was the fact that droughts and floods are being described as biblical. Scientists are warning that we're approaching an ecological catastrophe. The UK Secretary General claims that we're facing collective suicide. The US Brookings Institute warns of a climate cataclysm. And George Monbiot, not to be left out, worries about Insectageddon, where all the insects are going to die. And of course, just recently with the Tory parties doing their recent policy on development zones or investment zones, an attack on nature by a whole series of wildlife conservation groups. So, you know, there's a big rhetoric, if you like, which is suggesting that we're reaching the end of days or there's a real problem ahead of us. Young people are suffering from all kinds of kind of psychological worries about the future, and older people, as we can see with Just Stop Oil, doesn't have a generational disparity. So we're going to try and tackle a whole series of issues as to whether it is a climate crisis. If it is, what do we do about it? If it's not, what the hell are we doing anyway? And so we've got a great panel of speakers from kind of many sides of the argument, if you like, to really kind of put forward a nuanced perspective. So let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak, from my right to my left. We first of all have Martin Powell, head of sustainability at Siemens, former mayoral advisor on the environment for London, and editor of this book, Climate City, a terrific book, especially chapter 3, I think, which is by me. But a plug, and cheap at half the price, a really weighty tome. So my introductions are very cheap, a couple of sentences. There's much more detail, much more substance to these people than I can do justice to here. If you look on the website, there's a very full description about biographies. Second one, we have Orsolya Kovács-Magosi. Perfect, she says. Almost like a native. She's a PhD student and junior researcher at Corvinus University of Budapest, researcher of the Climate Policy Institute. Next, we have Dr. Shahrar Ali, who's just arrived, so he's stressed out at the moment. Former deputy leader of the Green Party and author of Why Vote Green. Again, much more detail to the gentleman online. And then finally, we're finishing with, wait for it, Dr. Nikos Sotirakopoulos, apologies, visiting fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, instructor at the Ayn Rand University, and author of this book, Identity Politics and Tribalism, the New Culture Wars, available on the bookstore upstairs. So, just going to have maybe 5 minutes or so from the speakers. I'll be reasonably rigorous with the timing. So we'll get about half an hour or so from the panel, and then it's just out to you for questions and comments. If there's anything on the panel when you finish that you disagree with what somebody said, we might have a little bit of argy-bargy, but then it's out to you, okay? So feel free to raise questions and comments. It doesn't have to be a Q&A. It can be whatever you think about the subject. Okay, let's start with Martin, please, if you would.
Great,
perfectly timed introduction.
I'm just going to read Austin's chapter from the book. So we can fly supersonically, we can land on the moon, we can deflect an asteroid, we can eradicate disease. So when somebody says, turn down the thermostat and wear a jumper so I can afford to stay warm, it does make me feel a little sad. We can provide carbon-free, affordable energy for everyone if we put our minds to it. This is not the biggest challenge humanity has faced. Tim Black, who's one of the articles Austin gave us as a pre-read, said, is this the end of day or end of days? Are we in such a crisis that we have no choice but to turn the heat down? Well, I say no. It's a signal that we have to adapt. But despite the hottest 10 years in history happened in the last 20 years, we've in fact had fewer fires, fewer deaths than in the last century. And that's a testament to the fact that we've already adapted. We've made ourselves more resilient. But how far will this go? Will it mean that I can no longer light a fire or have a barbecue? No more chip pan. I haven't had a chip pan for a while. But will it get to the point where I have to live underground or wear an astronaut suit to go out because it's just too hot? that's a long way off, but it is a reality if we don't change trajectory. So how do we do that without making people panic? People respond to calm, measured action. The problem is we have to be realistic about what's needed. So the IPCC, who signed up to climate emergency, and the phrasing as well, continue to issue a report that plots a 1.5 path that looks increasingly unlikely to achieve. And every year when they miss the target, they simply squeeze the targets on a year into the same time frame. And I think this is what creates anger, and this is what makes people angry. So I actually think we should simply accept and embrace a longer tail of fossil fuel dependency, continue to expand renewable energy, but ensure we keep it affordable, which is the key, and more importantly, begin to invest in measures that reverse the impact, that take CO2 out of the air, better out of the oceans. I've seen technology that takes dissolved CO2, calcium and magnesium out of the ocean and turns it into solid limestone. And it's actually how marine creatures make their seashells. So it's a perfectly valid process, creating more space in the ocean to absorb more CO2. So it buys us time, right? Buys us time in order to put more renewable energy in place. Since the very earliest cities, Mesopotamia, for example, we've built, destroyed the environment around us, and then we've repaired it. I can tell you London didn't always look like this. We've reversed the impacts of the damage over the years and made things better. I can tell you also a lot of living things perished along the way, but if you're not sentimental, they in fact thrive again and they can recover and come back, just not as the same people or things. Two last points. The Scientific American says an emergency is not breathing or turning blue or a pandemic that kills people, but not climate change. Well, maybe climate change is creeping up by stealth, like high cholesterol or a blocked artery. We could live for years, or we could have a stroke tomorrow. We don't actually know, and maybe the Earth just needs a giant statin to put us right. And then the last point, the Guardian article on overconsumption. We should go back to a simple life and consume less. And I think it's a complete myth to expect people to stop buying. It's a bit like asking people to turn the heat down or turn their lights off. We have a rising middle class in India and China. They won't accept a single TV policy. They want 3 TVs and 5 iPads like we all do. They want to waste food and heat like we all do. We are better figuring out how to capture the waste, return it back to the system, or design for an ever-consuming world. We have to innovate, and I believe this is an innovation story. I can tell you if we collected last night's, Saturday night's food waste just from London, it would power all of London's buses. Okay, you can take the food waste, put it in an anaerobic digester, turn it to biogas, hydrogen, and then fuel all of the buses. And my conclusion is calling it an emergency is not helpful if we continue to chart an unrealistic and undeliverable plan to overcome it. Calm, pragmatic, and affordable wins the day. Thank you very much.
Can I just quickly ask you, because you said a longer tail on fossil fuel dependency, what kind of timescale are you talking of?
I wouldn't put a time scale on it. I think we should, this may be an unpopular thing to say, but we should stop beating up the oil companies. There's a demand for it, so they are drilling and digging for it. What we should do is fix the problem. And the problem is too much CO2 in the air and in the ocean. And we can begin to reverse that, then we don't have to worry about that problem so much. We should then focus on putting more wind and solar into society and power everything renewably.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Ocean, please.
Okay, thank you. I would like to bring in the linguistic perspective of climate change and raise a question. Is it possible to talk about climate change in a way that is free from extremes and ideologies, or is it simply a utopian dream? Because for decades now, we've been speaking about this issue by using very different words to describe it. So basically, this is more or less the same phenomenon, but the discourse is very different. And I think that is not by an accident. And of course, as the time passes and the science expands, we need new scientific words to describe the discoveries. But I think that how a language has evolved around the climate change issue is not just about science, but it is also knowing the power of words and communication and using them and sometimes abusing them towards political ends. And when the environmental discourse began in the 1960s, it became a media attraction in the early 1980s, and it was all about global warming, you might remember. And it took a further decade for the term climate change to replace global warming, by the way, quite wrongly, because it's not really the same. But interestingly, we know that a language advisor in the Bush administration suggested that global warming should be replaced by climate change because he felt that global warming sounds too dangerous. And this was the second major paradigm in this discourse, up until the very appearance of the new youth-led environmental movements. I could mention the Fridays for Future, the Extinction Rebellion, or even the Sunrise Movement, and the publication of the IPCC special report on the 1.5-degree temperature rise. So this is the third paradigm in the discourse in which climate change is framed as an emergency and as a lethal threat. And you might have seen that the language has changed a lot and new words appeared. I could mention climate catastrophe, climate apocalypse, or even ecocide or global heating. And these words are usually called powerful language and are popularized by leading newspapers, for example, The Guardian. And interestingly, a lot of them have appeared in my language, in Hungarian, but the fact is that they do not make any sense. And I am sorry for ruining your ambitions to learn my language, if you want it. But the main question is whether this paradigm is effective enough or not. And my short answer for that is no, it isn't. And I also think that it can make things even worse. And I tell you the reasons why I'm believing this. So first of all, I think that all types of extremism in communication, whether it is climate change denial or scaremongering, is harmful and effective in the long run. Scientists are generally cautious with the words they use because you just can't say to people that we are all going to die, or the exact opposite, that climate change isn't a real problem or phenomenon. Secondly, we should pay attention to the original meaning of these words because the catastrophe or apocalypse are really extreme terms. This means the sudden end of something, the sudden end of the word. And if everything is a catastrophe, then nothing is. So there is a danger of the crying wolf. And finally, it is true that these kind of narratives of fear can trigger highly emotional responses from the audience, but it is also true that it doesn't translate into a long-term behavioral change, a pro-environmental behavioral change. So powerful language works like a double-edged sword, because part of the people who were already really interested in this matter will worry even more, and the rest will become indifferent because they will feel that it is totally exaggerated. So my opinion is that climate change communication should be improved because the wrongly chosen words can make things worse. They confuse the issue, they erode the goodwill and the willingness of the public to take the matter seriously. But I also don't say that we can never use these words and we should delete them from the dictionaries, but I say that we can find the context in which these words find their original meaning.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you very much. Dare I ask, do you have a better phrase that you want to use?
if I had one, then I will be sitting in the government and gaining a good salary. So I'm fine with climate change because, you know, if you use change, then there is the kind of possibility that this change can be bad and it can be good as well.
Very good, very good. All right, thank you very much. Shahrar. Good
Thanks.
job. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
So we are facing a climate crisis of existential proportions. There may be some disagreement amongst us on the panel even, and in the audience I'm sure, around what exactly is the scale of the emergency. How long have we got? That's a legitimate question, largely based in science. You may also wish to take account of the fact that there's a lag in the system. So, for example, hypothetically, if the human race were to be extinct today or tomorrow, would we have become extinct anyway because of the lag in the system? That is to say, whatever it is that we do now, is it already too late? That's already starting to sound a bit apocalyptic, I grant you that. But I think what this debate needs to be about, should be about, is not, is it okay to talk in apocalyptic terms or not? But to whom should we be addressing in a particular way or not? The real issue here is, I would say different strokes for different folks. Some people do act as if, despite the evidence of our senses with melting ice caps and rising sea levels, some people do act as if there's nothing to worry about. Some people do act as if a business as usual approach can be maintained for as long as possible. This isn't the way forward. We do need to change what is politically possible to do what's scientifically necessary. It is hard. We are at a point in human civilization where we are burdened not just with what's going to happen to our contemporaries. You can see the floods in Pakistan, for example. You can see even in Western Europe, the Rhineland, just last year, the kind of devastation that was unleashed by nature. So these are devastating effects that are happening on our watch. And the burden is great. The burden on this generation is great. It's rather a lot to have on our shoulders, and it is overwhelming. And whilst we might concern ourselves with not upsetting the younger generation, I would say that the youth of today are the ones who are showing great leadership. Because guess what? They're being quite objective about their chances. They, as much as anybody, understands how much it's going to impact their futures because they are young. So what I hope we won't have to have a debate around as such is the evidence of our senses. The fact that we are facing a climate crisis. Now, you may not wish to say it's of existential proportions. I do think that that is an objective way of putting it. But ultimately, it's okay to talk in those terms, not because it's alarmist, but the situation we find ourselves in is alarming. So what the debate then needs to move towards is what's the most effective means of getting us to the place that we need to get to? And that's a debate about liberty. That's a question, as we see with the ill-fated attempts often of direct action campaigners, whether it's in the National Gallery or yesterday I was actually approached by a man, very civilized, on the Underground. Could I trouble you with this leaflet about the climate crisis? Yeah, absolutely. I took it, I read it. And it's Extinction Rebellion. They were trying to galvanize and mobilize opinion for a march in April 2023. Now, that's a very polite way of campaigning, and arguably it's more effective. but it may not be up to the scale of the challenge. And that's why we're increasingly faced now with a very frustrated, by all means, subset of the population who feels that they do understand the scale of the emergency, and they're trying to jolt us out of inaction and institutional inertia. And they've got a lot to contend with. They've got a lot to contend with because we are creatures of habit. You may say that the American dream is not worth having, but it's far more difficult to force people into a situation when they're just going on this path of economic growth to say, actually, that's unsustainable. We're not in a position where you can have your cake and eat it, even though we have been enjoying the fruits of yours and others' labour and plundering the Earth's resources like there's no tomorrow. So finally, I must be coming towards the end. So, there are three basic issues here. First of all, there is the climate science and what is the scale of the emergency that faces us. And we can have differences of degree on how long we've got, and that's absolutely fine. But I haven't heard anybody so far on the panel deny that we are facing a very uncertain future. Secondly, depending on how long you think we've got, that is going to affect the emotional and rational response that you are going to encourage and instill of others. And that's up for grabs. And finally, let's have a think about liberty. Because as increasingly, and it's not just the youth marching on Westminster and on a so-called school climate strike, I actually think they do have the wherewithal to understand how bad it is. Let's have a think about how far we're prepared and what means we think are most effective in jolting people out of inaction, because I'm afraid we can't carry on business as usual.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. As I've asked everybody else, and Orsolya was basically talking about climate change being potentially changed for good or for bad, it's up for grabs. In terms of you kind of posing the need for action to change things, to challenge things. In terms of your Pakistan floods example, would you argue that that's an example of too much development or too little development? What's the issue that you're dealing with in there?
It's a double injustice, because what that really shows up in extremis is how, generally speaking, in developing countries, those who are least responsible for the impact of climate change are most unable to afford the remedial action required to contend with it. So they're dealing with an immediate emergency of trying to save their own lives from being drowned, and they weren't primarily responsible. The so-called West have been primarily responsible. Per capita of population, the EU and United States, for example, 4% of the population, 25% of the carbon emissions. So what we're seeing there is a kind of a double injustice, a climate double injustice.
Okay, thanks very much. Please, Nikos.
Thank you. So for the last 3 years, humanity has faced a challenge which was very important, and it was the pandemic. Now imagine if in the most crucial stage of the pandemic, we would say that we need to assemble a team of people who will tell us what to do, and people who will tell us what is the narrative through which we will see this challenge. And imagine if this dream team was Alex Jones, David Icke, and Robert Kennedy Jr. The result would be a catastrophe. Why? Because these are people whose track record, whose values, and whose way of thinking makes them really unfit to deal with the situation. Climate change is indeed a big challenge. But my fear is the people from which we take our marching orders on how to understand this problem are more credible than the likes of Alex Jones, but they have the same problem. That is, their track record, their value, and their way of thinking is wrong. I don't want to discuss on the track record of environmentalism, because there's a good chance that someone might have been wrong many times, but they might be correct these times. So I want to focus on the other two things, their values and their way of thinking. So the bigger the problem, the more precise we have to be on how to approach it. So climate change as a problem, our focus should be how do we make nature more hospitable for us? How we protect human life and human flourishing from the challenges of nature. But many prominent voices in the environmental movement have a different approach. Their approach is how do we make sure that as humans we have as little impact on nature as possible? This is completely the wrong approach, because the way we survive and the way we flourish is by having more impact on nature. Now, this has to be a clever impact. Destroying our environment is something completely stupid and not to our interest. But think about, for example, nuclear energy. How does it make sense that we face an emergency, and we are probably facing an emergency, and yet climate change is not, and yet climate activists are not going to the barricades for more nuclear energy? Some do, but few. Why are they not talking more about big hydroelectric plants, for example? Because a big hydroelectric plant has a big impact on the environment for the salmons or for other animals. So what does this show us? That their standard is not human life and human flourishing. Their standard is an intact nature. Or think about their way of thinking, and for me this is the biggest problem. We keep hearing about the side effects of fossil fuels, and we all know them. But what about the benefits of fossil fuels for billions of people, even today, in India, China, but as we find out, even in the West? So imagine, not imagine, you see it. How flawed is the approach of the anti-vaxxers who cannot shut up about the bad side effects of the vaccine? And they fail to mention that the vaccines have actually saved millions of lives. And yet we do the same mistake with energy. We focus on their existing bad effects, and we don't mention the colossal benefits that they have brought us. So by thinking about this problem in the wrong way, we make sure that we're not going to find a solution. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Greece and I was storing a lot of wood, a lot of logs in my family house for the winter. And I thought, how weird. Every year, we would store some logs for the fireplace because we wanted Christmas to be cozy. This year, we're doing it so that we don't freeze in the winter. And I thought, what a step back. And it reminded me that line, like Ayn Rand 50 years ago, when she would try to capture the essence of environmentalism, she called it the return of the primitive. And I thought, indeed, we're going back. We should be in the era of, nuclear or geoengineering, and we're in the era where we're storing logs for the fireplace. But this is not a coincidence. This is where we are led by this way of thinking, which says that the way to flourish and to solve problems is, number one, to curtail our freedom and our mind, and number two, to try to have as little impact on nature as possible. So it is a big problem, but the bigger the problem, the more we have to use our most potent weapons. And the most potent weapon is to have the freedom to use our mind and to experiment. Whether it's going to be geoengineering, as you said, absorbing carbon footprint. Imagine if a meteor was coming towards the Earth. If you are facing an existential threat, what do you say? Let's try everything. Let's let people experiment. Instead, what are we doing? Well, let's cut a bit of fossil fuels, which we know in terms of what is the temperature difference it's going to bring within 10 years, it's not going to do anything. And actually, it's going to harm a lot of people. So let's think about this topic in the correct way, having human flourishing as our focus and as our value and goal. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Since I've asked everybody else a quick question, a quick answer, difficult, a very broad, sweep question. Why is it, because Shahrar was mentioning how young people are at the forefront of this, what is it about young people in particular, or generally the social moment, that makes people have that looking backwards reactionary viewpoint, as you're pointing out?
Well, because the culture for the last 30, 40 years have been telling us that human agency is bad. That whenever human beings are trying to do something, they're ruining things. Therefore, you view humans and human achievement, like art, as something problematic. Of course, the people who vandalize the museum are a minority. I don't think they represent the whole of the environmental movement. But the anti-humanism of the act is prevalent. Humans are not the problem. They are the only standard of value and obviously the solution to all our problems.
Very good, short and sharp. All right, it's kind of out to you, ladies and gentlemen. Is there a climate emergency? Is there a climate crisis? Whatever you want to call it. I'm old enough to remember the emergency in India, which had a devastating effect in terms of lockdown and internment and censorship. And the word emergency for me, like COVID emergency, again with lockdown and restrictions on human activity, very often has a negative connotation. So that's my 5 penneth worth. But 75% of all local authority councils in this country have declared a climate emergency. So there's something going on. Anyway, lots of hands. I probably won't be able to take everybody. We'll take a batch, 5, 6 or so, and then we'll come to the panel, and then I'll go back out again.
I'd like to pick up immediately on what you just said at the end, which is I believe that the so-called climate crisis is the secularization of original sin. In other words, to be human is to be bad, according to the climate lobby. That's the first thing I'd like to say. Second thing is that the whole idea that CO2 drives climate is false. It falls into what is the single cause fallacy. The single cause fallacy is to take a very complex problem and reduce it down to a single cause. We know that the climate is a multifaceted agency, and it's not driven by CO2. It is driven by factors far more powerful than CO2, including the 11-year sunspot cycle, the fact that the moon's orbit is not circular but elliptical, and so the gravitational changes on the moon pull the oceans. Well, that changes the ocean currents. There are 12 major ocean currents. They are the driving factor of climate, not CO2. The Coriolis effect, which is the fact that the Earth is a globe spinning on its axis, causing a turbulence in the liquid oceans, that is the cause of climate change. Volcanic activity, that is the cause of climate change. And the Earth is a nuclear reactor. It's got plutonium in it. It creates its own heat. That is the cause of climate change. CO2 may be a cause of climate change, but it's a minor cause of climate change, and human part of that CO2 is a minuscule part of the whole. So to take the activities of human beings and claim that that is the cause of the so-called climate change catastrophe is an absolute travesty of science. It's not climate science, it's climate mythology. And the last thing I'd like to say, talking about the lady who notices the changes of language, is that there was a strategic change from the word global warming to the word climate change. Now, this wasn't accidental. It's because the climate change concept is not a scientific concept because it does not make predictions. Climate change will encompass any change. Hotter, it's climate change. Colder, it's climate change. Wetter, it's climate change. Drier, it's climate change. It makes no predictions, and therefore it is not a scientific hypothesis. It is what scientists call a void hypothesis. In order to be a scientific hypothesis, it has to be able to make predictions which may be tested against experience. Okay. Just one more sentence. Global warming does make predictions, and it has failed every prediction they've made. They cannot get their global warming concept to work, so they've reduced it and broadened it out to climate change.
Grand.
So on all those levels, I think they're false.
That's very important contribution.
Sorry. At COP26 last year, Boris Johnson stood up and said, we are 1 minute to midnight, and then he said we're going to become the Saudi Arabia wind, which sounded like a lot of hot air, but that's what he said. Now, a week after that, the Chinese announced record coal production. They produced 12 million tons in a day. And not only did they do that, but they celebrated it across their whole country. They planned something like 700 coal-fired power stations as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, of which they've built around 300. So my question is, are there no scientists in China? Or do they not believe this? Do they think that we're mad and that they're carrying on? And the same for India, Brazil, and what have you. Are there no scientists in China, or do they just not believe this?
Thank you.
Our second speaker talked about the fact that we should be careful with the words that we use and that things like catastrophe have a real meaning and that we should sort of go back to their original meaning when we use them. But in a phrase like climate change, you have, or climate catastrophe, you also have the first word, climate. And climate basically means just things around you, like, or an environment, like the things that are around you. And if you do that sort of analysis for that word, you could also say, hey, but the things around us, our human world has become better and better over the past 100 years. And in that sense, is there really a catastrophe in the sense that our standard of living is higher than ever before, our human climate is better than ever before, and then, yeah, there might be aspects that are sort of where things are going downhill and that where we need to innovate, but that those should be placed in context of the real meaning of what sort of the human climate, so to say.
I was interested to reply to the guy. I mean, there's stuff about sunspots and ocean currents. I mean, the IOPC and the Royal Society, the greatest scientists in the world, have taken those things into account. I would say I'm an environmentalist. I think it's a human-centered approach. If you look at the environmental movement in America, how it started, it was largely poor black communities suffering from air pollution. I have empathy for the people being kicked off their land, for mines, indigenous people being wiped away. That's a good reason to be an environmentalist for human beings. I disagree with the dichotomy, which is like, well, either you love humans and human ingenuity, or you think all humans are bad and you're an environmentalist. I think that's a false dichotomy. I would say charities like Friends of the Earth are actually corrupt. They don't embrace things like nuclear power because they don't have an AGM, they don't let their members decide, and they're steadily moving towards being friends of the woke rather than actually embracing new solutions. And I'm an environmentalist. I actually am in favour of nuclear power, high-speed rail, and these are good things, and they're good for society. I was wondering about the blueprint and what you disagree with fundamentally. If there's a move, a technological shift to electric cars, people and women being empowered to not have more than 3 or 4 children, all these are good things, and they're good for human society. Cleaner air in London. And again, another human-centered environmental group, Mums for Lungs. They just care about their children having clean air. I mean, that's not a conflict between humans and environment. That's both sides winning. And I think we should embrace environmentalism. If you're involved in Christian Aid or Oxfam, there are indigenous communities in Africa where the rains don't come and they are suffering, and they are human beings who are suffering. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm proudly an environmentalist. I would love to see, for example, charities like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, that they don't seem to have like a blueprint, which is like, okay, these are the reductions that we need. This is how we're going to meet it via renewable energy, electric cars, nuclear energy. No one seems to have written this blueprint. And I'd love to see that environmental blueprint for a greener world where human beings can flourish. And those details should be the things that we're disagreeing on, rather than this kind of neural shortcut of like, oh, environmentalists must hate all people and not want any children and want the economy to be destroyed versus, the opposite of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Shahrar has written a book called Why Vote Green. There's a little bit of a manifesto commitment in there.
So I just want to make 2 comments, 2 comparisons, if you allow me, or cut me off after the first one if I go on too long. But so obviously we hear a lot these days about catastrophe against catastrophizing, believer and denier, this sort of dichotomy, which I think is very unhelpful. And I want to give a comparison to illustrate this. We've just been through this pandemic, which some of you may remember. And with the pandemic, it was very interesting. Often the governments were saying our policy is informed by the science. But of course, the question of the proportionality of lockdown was not a question science could answer. It was to do with risk or culturally specific attitudes to risk, indeed very personal attitudes as to what's an acceptable risk. Jonathan Sumption had a great distillation of this. He said, is there more to life than the avoidance of death? And this is a very subjective, very philosophical, very political question. In a sense, once the science is decided, all the real questions for society remain unanswered. I'd put it to you that the discussion of climate is structured very similarly to the discussion, the debate around COVID, because it involves an understanding of something scientific and then its societal consequence and our reaction. And I think that one of the issues when we come into this discussion is whether it's catastrophe or catastrophizing, is it somewhat gets away from the fact that a lot of the questions are about how we react. There's a whole field of academic literature called disaster risk reduction scholarship. And they have been dining out on a single insight for the last 40 years, which is this: earthquakes don't kill people. What kills people is collapsing buildings. The point being that the conditions of vulnerability and disaster are societal. And so you cannot draw like a classical mechanical sort of Newton's laws of motion, the idea that the climate causes a societal outcome in a linear way. It's all to do with us. So that's my first comparison with COVID, because I think sometimes this debate becomes very political, very polarized. I think there is a third perspective where we should probably assume the climate's changing for the sake of argument, be risk averse. But then all the interesting questions remain unanswered. First comparison. Do I have time just for a very quick second one? It's much shorter. We've mentioned sort of the secularization of things with climate. What I'm about to say may sound like a conspiracy theory. It's not meant to. It's more of a pattern in the culture that I think is interesting. So if you look at the structure, well, in the 11th century, they had these millenarian movements emerge. In the run-up to the year 1000, people thought Christ would return. And when he didn't return on the year 1000, they thought it would be 1033. And these millenarian cults emerged thinking Judgment Day would come and so on. It's very interesting for me that in the run-up to the year 2000, we had the Y2K sort of idea the world was about to end, and it didn't happen. And now we're waiting for we've seen this climate narrative grow the last few years, and all the predictions at the point of no return are all like 2030 something. And for me, it seems surprisingly similar in the structure of the culture. And I wonder to what extent, when people talked about it being about original sin, I think actually what the climate is a secularization of a sort of Judgment Day narrative, this idea that the end is coming, that we are responsible, that we have sinned against things. But it's a secular culture playing out the same patterns of what is still a Christian culture. The shape of our culture is still that way. So I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy, more just an interesting pattern, which may or may not have merit. Thank you.
Very good indeed. Right, I'll take one more.
If each of the panel members were like global engineers and they could turn a dial, this is in a perfect world, and it would achieve a concentration in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, what would they pick that to be? Precisely, that is, in parts per million. And what temperature would that lead to in different parts of the globe? And I'll give you a clue that basically the parameters range through deep time from 10,000 parts per million approximately down to 150. My personal preference would be to it not to go below 150, because that's game over for all life, because carbon dioxide is a plant food. It's not a pollutant. So if, assuming, against this chap's splendid speech, that there is a causal relationship directly between carbon dioxide and temperature, what would they pick? And if they can't tell me precisely in parts per million, then would they retire their opinion from the field, please?
Okay, there's a couple of open questions, philosophical questions, practical questions, and a challenge, statistical challenge. Do you want to go first?
I can go, yeah.
Okay.
Might make me a bit unpopular. Starting with myself, I think 99.9% of the people in this room, we cannot judge climate science. Sorry, we can judge in its interpretation. We can judge what are the values based on which we approach the challenge, but we cannot judge the science itself. Now, I have a lot of reasons to assume that the way the IPCC interprets the data is particularly biased, but I'm not in a position, and you should say this guy is full of BS, if I told you that I can understand the science behind it. So we have to be very, very careful on the statements that we make on this topic. On the gentleman who self-identified as an environmentalist. So all the things you mentioned are good. Electric cars, I love them, also because they sound like kids from Knight Rider. So all this is good. The thing which is not good is taking away, trying to coerce other parts of the industry, as for example, petrol cars, in order to make electric cars more affordable or more appealing. So that's why I said that freedom is not a luxury. Freedom is an existential necessity if we have to solve these problems. So we're never going to solve a problem by trying to limit the freedom of industry or limit the freedom of energy companies, which, as someone else said today, we should totally change the way we view them. They're doing something very moral. They're the bloodline to everything that our civilization depends. And I have more thoughts, but let's go.
You sure? Okay. Shahrar, anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I mean, I really like audiences like this because it just reminds you of the scale of the challenge, actually, to be honest. And when you've got two people who are self-identifying environmentalists prepared to put their hand to that. Look, there's a lot going on. Let me start with the comment, the penultimate comment around there's more to life than the avoidance of death, right? And I think I might be able to help here as a sometime moral philosopher. That's really important. There is. And it could be liberty, actually. And you've been talking about freedom. I take it that you're a champion of freedom. You don't like people being oppressed and being told what to do. That's authoritarian tendency. I would agree with you. People also don't take very well to certain types of non-violent direct action, blocking the M25, stopping emergency vehicles, gluing themselves to railings. If that just affects them, maybe fine. But if they're spoiling masterpieces as well, it's rubbing people up the wrong way. It's not winning friends and influencing people. So liberty is actually at the heart of this. And I would say that I have a fear that the societies won't undertake the scale of the change that's necessary in order to get us out of the current existential rut. But that's not something that I'm prepared to go beyond a certain point politically to change. I can't compel people beyond a certain point. What I can use is my voice, my democratic license, my capacity or ability to speak to people who are, there's various levels of denial. There could be denial about the scale of the emergency, denial about the cause of it scientifically, and denial about the psychological possibilities in order to overcome it. Caricatures, if I may say, this is directed at you. I think you're using a lot of straw men around what environmentalists are like. We don't hate people. In fact, the opposite is the case. We relish human existence and human experience. It's because of that we understand that the prize is great and the risk of failure is severe. But the point then, the philosophical question around what are the things which are more important and give life value, that make even the avoidance of death not the most important thing, are things like liberty. So I would say that, if people might have a fear around green authoritarianism, or you might even call it green fascism, I don't think we've seen anything like that yet. But the fear is then surely trying to subdue the human spirit and oppress people makes the human beings themselves not worth living for. So I would say that there are things that we will risk endangering in order to get where we need to get. And ultimately, because we hold those values dear to ourselves, liberty being one of them, we may not actually get where we need to get. So if you say, well, we can't coerce people into using electric cars, well, that's actually going to spew more CO2 and toxins into the environment, then so be it. Well, then so be it, if you think that freedom is so great. But, there are win-wins, as the environmentalists, self-professed environmentalists said. The win-win is that, the Green Party's understanding is that when you do more of these things which are good for the environment and climate, you will actually have a more flourishing existence at the same time. When you stop buying products in supermarkets, for example, and I don't mean milk, but when you stop buying these products, with high food miles and packaging, and growing your own vegetables and creating more community gardens where you can do that, and sharing, recipes with people. London is an extraordinary place to have an allotment, actually, the amount of people that you can share ideas with. But it's that rewardingness of actually growing food, being in contact with the earth. There's nothing wrong in having that symbiosis with the earth. To some extent, our urban communities are actually divorcing us from that. But that contact with the earth, that spiritual connection almost, is very important. So there's a win-win there in having a lower consumption lifestyle, in being engaged and understanding what's really important in life.
Very good. Okay, thanks. But I do think that if we are playing the game of linguistically saying there's a catastrophe, then in some ways, all better off. If you think that we're leading to Armageddon, and then you think, well, maybe, we can play by some democratic rules, then, you think, well, where's the catastrophe? If it is a catastrophe, if it is Armageddon, if we are all going to die, the world's going to end, then all bets are off, and green fascism might be the way forward. So I just think that we have to be a bit. I mean, that's the way it works, isn't it? Come back on that later, or ignore me. I don't mind. Orsolya.
Okay, so I would like to reflect on the language and the terms, because climate change obviously is becoming a kind of a buzzword and an umbrella term, and everything is under it, from veganism to CO2. And that's what happened, I think, with sustainability, with the word sustainability. It was overused, and we use this climate prefix for everything. Sorry to say that I call it sometimes as climate bullshitting. And for example, climate protection, which is always in the campaigns of the youth-led movements in Hungarian, really doesn't make any sense, because you don't understand whether you protect yourself from the climate or you protect the climate itself. You don't understand it. And also climate, this word, means in Hungarian the air conditioning system. So if you say that I'm conducting research on climate, then don't be surprised if everyone asks, okay, can you come to my house? It's just broken down. So it's really problematic. However, I don't have now anything better, and what I see is that it's the English language which paves the way for the new terms, and Hungarian and I suppose the other languages borrows these terms, but it's way more better than the catastrophe, in my opinion.
Very good, thank you very much. Mine.
Okay, wow. So, to the very first question, I think society has done a great thing using CO2 as a measure, trying to boil that down to something tangible. It gives us an opportunity to focus, create priorities, think about the things that matter. I've studied orbital mechanics. I'm an engineer. I can tell you these are wonderful things that we can't yet control. But what we can control are the emissions that we put into the atmosphere, and those are the things, the controllable emissions, that we should focus on bringing out. 1 minute to midnight, China weren't celebrating the most coal. They were celebrating that they were keeping their citizens warm. In the same year, I can also tell you that they produce more renewable energy than they ever had before. So their transition is underway. I can also tell you that Shenzhen in China has 14,000 buses, and I can tell you that 14,000 of them are pure electric. So they are shifting to an electrical economy faster than any other city, or actually country in the world. To my environmentalist friend at the back, nuclear power I'm actually a fan of, but the problem is in 1982, I was 12, I know it's hard to believe, Raymond Briggs wrote a book called When the Wind Blows. How many of you know this book? Yeah, it's fabulous. It terrified me as a 12-year-old. No one should read a children's book about a nuclear holocaust and how to survive it. And that's actually what the book is about. Google it, it's there online. This gave me several years of anxiety that I could have done without. And that's what we are doing today. We are creating anxiety in people that we're not actually ready to do. And it actually made me think nuclear is a bad thing in every essence. So I wouldn't have built CERN, and I wouldn't have built a nuclear power plant, because I just associate it with a weapon, right? So we have to be a little careful, because nuclear actually may give us a fundamentally long-term and powerful solution for the planet. And then just a couple of people mentioned air pollution. I can tell you, walking here today, you've walked through Westminster, which has the most toxic air in Europe. I don't know if any of you knew that, but you're walking through the highest toxic air area in Europe. And that's a result of us again, controllable emissions, okay? Air pollution comes from salt and sand from the Sahara and from the North Sea, but it comes from the burning of fossil fuels from vehicles and from our buildings. So the faster that we can electrify our society, come off those within our built-up dense urban areas, the faster we're going to have a healthier, better life. And then I think, to the gentleman at the back, 325 parts per million. Thank you very much.
Very good. Well, I come from South Wales, and I'm even older than you, mind, which is hard to believe, but I remember what air pollution used to be like. So if this is the worst in Europe, then we've done a good job.
Can I ask the panel to comment on the fact that we are trying to drive towards electric vehicles? We all think electric vehicles are great, yes? No? Okay, fine. On the wrong side. The problem with them is most of the stuff that goes into the batteries is rare earth. Most of that rare earth is mined in conflict zones. So in order to get to where we want to get to, we have got to resolve the conflicts. If we don't do that, we've had it, in simple terms. One. Two.
How many numbers have you got?
Only two.
Okay.
No, only two. I'm fairly brief. The other thing is this. When we talk about this stuff, we talk about it in terms of economics in reality. I read a book when I read economics way back in the 70s called Small is Beautiful. Don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. Yeah, written by a guy called Ernst Schumacher. And what he said is, if you're going to look at how you do something economically, you have to look at it from the good of the whole community. If you don't do that, forget it. Go home, have your tea. So my question is, how do we start to come with this idea of we look at the things economically, but with everybody involved?
Right, very good.
Because I get the green thing, I really do. We're buying a new house. It's the first time we were going to buy a new house in our lives. We've been married nearly 50 years. But the funny thing is with it, it's triple glazed, a standard. It's got 3 solar panels on it. All the walls have got mega insulation in it, so it's going to be pretty efficient. And we're getting better at building things. So we stand a fighting chance of doing it in that way if we build better and smarter.
Okay, thank you very much. See, actually, there's more secret environmentalists than we thought. Yeah.
Well, my answer to the numbers question is 42. But that's all by the way. I just want to say, first to Martin and then to Shahrar. Martin, Siemens has been a client for me. I love Siemens. I'm told when Siemens engineers were introduced to Indian trains, they fainted when they found out, just how many people were crammed onto those trains. But I'm bound to ask you, I think energy from waste is a non-starter. It's just not efficient. If you would like to join me in collecting all the food waste from London tonight, I submit that it would be a very labour-intensive job. No robots allowed, and it would take forever, so we're not going to do it. What I'm a bit more interested in, and this is not to be nasty because I like Siemens, is I just happened to be leafing through Balkan Green Energy News recently, and I find that wind turbine giant Siemens Gamesa is to lay off 10% of its workforce, 800 jobs in Denmark, 300 in Germany, 475 in Spain, and 50 in the UK. You can see we're punching above our weight there, leading the world in renewables. I'm very sad about that. I'm not making fun of it. But my question to you is, what does that say about real demand for renewables and onshore and offshore? And since you're keen on waste, what does Siemens do with the detritus and waste from wind turbines? Are they turned into energy too? And very briefly to Shahrar, can you tell me very kindly what happens every morning, Shahrar? Every morning on Earth, what happens when we have dawn?
You have breakfast?
No,
The sun
but
comes up?
the sun comes up, right? But you're wrong, because it's actually the Earth turning. And
Well,
that's
I was just about to correct him.
Can I finish?
I speak on your behalf there, Shahrar.
Thank you. The point is that if you go by the evidence of our senses, you will conclude, which is the phrase you repeated twice, you will conclude that the Pakistani floods are just to do with climate change, not the corruption of the Pakistani regime. And you will also believe that because we had drought for 2 days this summer, the evidence of our senses says that we're heading for some Greek word. I hope Nikos will comment on catastrophe, apocalypse,
All Greek
and all Greek words. Why is that? But either way, by relying on your senses, you are the antithesis of science. Science explains that there's something different from what our sense data reveal. You as a moral philosopher should know that. We have to get behind things. And therefore, I'm not espoused of your philosophy on the evidence of our senses.
Okay. Sharon's bursting to come back in, but I'll keep out with you for a few more questions.
Thank you. I have a question also for Shahrar. You came here last year, you're here this year, to the Lion's Den, a crowd of people who disagree with you. And it's a rare ability to want to do that. And I just wanted to ask, how is it you have appeared here in the Lion's Den? And I just wanted to thank you for that. I'm then going to try and attack your views because I'm a lion, and here we are in the den. I'm going to take the favourite skeptics data set about the temperature rise. So you can look at the atmospheric satellite temperature record, and it shows a warming over the 80s and 90s, and then very much a flatlining since then. And the green, the non-skeptics would say, well, if you look at the Earth data from the land rather than the satellite readings, we have had continued warming, and this problem is therefore one that needs to be addressed. And so what I want anybody here to do who has even the faintest skill at Excel or Google Sheets or R or Python is to go to the Met Office, or if you want to the Hungarian equivalent or the Greek equivalent, and download a single data set, any data set that shows you historic temperatures for a single location, and just see on that location what's happened to the temperature. So I did this this week, and I did it for Heathrow, for Valley in North Wales, and for somewhere in North Somerset. I forget the name. And all three of them showed a temperature rise in the 80s and 90s, and then it flatlining. And so for me to hear apocalypse, catastrophe, and yet the last 20 years, no temperature rise in those three locations of statistical significance, and there's a small rise, but it would take 400 years to get to 1 degree, then I find it difficult to become alarmed and difficult to follow the words that the brave Dr. Ali have suggested. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm quite shocked, really, to be walking into this room today, that the person who I think's spoken the most sense is the man at the front, second from my right on the stage. Yeah. I just thought it was a given that there was a climate crisis. I didn't realise that there was much doubt about it. So perhaps the people who do think there's a climate crisis are so depressed about it that they decided they didn't want to come into the room today. But yeah, that's kind of my thought. Just a practical point, really. It seems to me that, assuming there is a crisis, that we're kind of hoping on a prayer that some kind of technology innovation will save us. I think that's perhaps wishful thinking. I don't think it will happen. So what could we practically do, assuming there is this crisis? Well, it seems that the CO2 and greenhouse emissions is a product of average CO2 production per person times the number of people. So perhaps the best thing to do is a demographic shift. And I don't think it will go down too well to start knocking people off. So it seems to me that the way forwards would be a sort of a child policy, like a birth rate policy, where we basically say you can have one child or no child, that kind of a thing, and that would solve the problem.
The point you say is assuming there is a crisis, but in this room, not everybody does assume, I think, that there is a crisis, and it needs defining. Obviously, if you assume it, then that's a starting point for a different argument. But then it also comes to that conversation we had earlier about human-centered or nature-centered, and if there is a Malthusian one-child policy, then I think it goes to Nikos's argument rather than Shahrar's at this point. So, but I'm more than happy to have an environmental argument with humans first would be very, very useful. Shahrar has already started that conversation.
I think the guy who spoke the most sense in the room is the guy at the front, right? There's not one driver of climate. I mean, to reduce it to CO2 is just, you know, it's completely anti-science. It's not a big black box with a knob where you turn it up or turn it down, right? But you know, I was interested in what you said about secularization of original sin, because I was brought up a Catholic and I recognise that, you know, but there aren't, in the same way that there isn't just one driver of climate alarmism. I'm interested in that. There are many drivers of climate alarmism, you know. You're not an anti-humanist. I firmly believe that, right? I think you have a lot in common with the guy on the end, right? About you didn't say human flourishing, but I think that's what you were talking about. But one of the drivers, I think, about climate that drives climate alarmism, and there are many, is it's a gravy train. And I don't mean that. It's a gravy train. I don't mean that in a crude reductionist way, that it's a con, like the people say, you know, it's a con or it's fraudulent. But last time I Googled MBA in sustainability or climate, I think I got about 3.5 million hits. That's postgraduates, that's management, business administration. There's a growing class of people in the world, in this country, whose jobs rely on the proliferation of alarm. They come out of universities, right? They go into universities. Universities rely on them for income, right? You know, they are popular courses. They go into management. They go into Siemens. They go into councils, and they're the people who stamp and spindle, and they're the climate police. They're the people who ration and look after us all. Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very good.
Alex Epstein, the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, centres his argument on the concept of human flourishing, which I think Nikos did actually mention.
I'm plagiarizing Alex shamelessly, but that's because I like it.
Okay. But I think you did, I think you certainly posited this distinction between a human-centred and environment-centred world or perspective. I'm sort of interested in this from a moral perspective, because I like the idea of human flourishing, of human progress. It sounds like a wonderful idea. But on moral grounds, I find it a bit trickier to argue against an assumption that humans, by nature, have a higher moral claim than other parts of the natural world. And I think outside of this room, when I have arguments with environmentalists and so on, this comes up in a way that hasn't come up in this room. I think there are lots of people who do genuinely have an issue with it. You know, why should I presume that just because I have a higher level of consciousness than a whale, I should necessarily have a higher level of moral consideration? So I think, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm looking for the answer to that, because in moral terms and in logic, I can't quite close that case. Why, you know, so that's my question.
It is that argument that when a whale starts writing some moral philosophy, I'll buy into their equivalence. But you know, we give natural world maybe moral and ethical legitimacy rather than it being taken or it being natural. So I think that's something. And I think the other thing which was mentioned as well is that, you know, we talk about crisis. There is and I'm being flippant about there being a climate crisis, but there is now a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis. And it was very interesting that a lot of the renewable energy companies were basically arguing that they didn't have enough profits to keep going. So you kind of think these are the guys who are saving the planet on the basis of their renewable strategies, but if they don't make a profit, they ain't going to do it. So, you know, capitalism prevails over all of this kind of moral conversation as well. Anyway, enough from me. Very quick comebacks, if that's all right, and then I'll manage to get maybe 2 or 3 other questions back again. So, Nikos, yeah.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So let me start. Shahrar mentioned that I strawman environmentalists as anti-humanists, and if I did this, that would be a very big problem. But here's why I didn't. Being anti-humanist doesn't mean that you wake up in the morning and you say, how am I going to harm human beings today? This is a very, very small minority in every movement who thinks like that. Being anti-humanist means that the main premises, the main ideas, the main values in a movement are going to harm human life and human flourishing. And the main values and ideas of the environmental movement are against human flourishing. With the most important one, the idea that says that the standard should be how are we going to have as little impact in nature as possible. Not all environmentalists share this, but this is a very central premise in the environmental movement. Your second point, very interesting one. How can we say that, that human beings have a higher moral claim than, let's say, whales? Because without humanity, there is no morality. The mere act of valuing, of appreciating, is something which only humans can do. I'm a huge fan, fan is weird, I'm a huge proponent of whales, or how to put it. I've been an activist in my life for saving the whales, but this is because I'm a human being and I can appreciate their beauty. They have selfish value to me, to put it this way. So it makes sense to be a steward of nature because you appreciate nature, but only humans can do that, because only we have the capacity to value and appreciate, because only we have the capacity to use our reason.
Thank you very much. Since Mark Drakeford came into power, you don't very often hear the sentence, "I'm a big fan of whales." Anyway, Shahrar.
Yeah, I mean, just to try and knock a few things off, I'm bound not to answer a question until I've understood the question. So that was what was going on there. Of course, by evidence of senses, I meant rising sea levels and melting ice caps, and not wishing to pull rank in any form, but you might be interested to know that I started life as a biochemical engineer. Science was my bread and butter, and did a stint at the European Parliament in the Science and Technology Options Assessment Unit, where we were looking at risk. So, values need to be negotiated. We need to understand, for example, whether overall, on balance, GM crops is going to be more harmful than beneficial. So the evidence of our senses is just a catch-all expression, meaning we should be evidence-based. So we use our senses as a means of doing that as true empiricists. Yes, the Greek term. I mean, most philosophers were empiricists. They were the founding philosophers. In terms of, the lion's den, this is the battle of ideas after all, but I think ultimately the motivation for wanting to discuss and debate, and it does go to the heart of the battle of ideas, with people who might instinctively disagree with you or prima facie disagree with you, is because whether or not you all raise your hands to say that you're self-professedly environmentalists, I think you're self-professedly rationalists. And so I want to be able to win people over through, and I may not be doing such a good job of it, who knows, but through the power of debate, through the power of rational persuasion. And so we can have a debate around proximate cause, for example, and conclusive falsifiability, and what is genuine science. It is absolutely the case, and it's not an appeal to authority to talk about the IPCC and others. It is absolutely the case that post-industrial revolution, human beings have been the predominant reason for the climate emergency man-made emissions that we're currently facing. There's an exponential trajectory on CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So this is a proximate cause. It doesn't mean that there aren't other things and haven't been other things going on in the background as well. But scientists need to look at proximate causes and ultimate justifications and reasons. In terms of, finally, yes, technology. There was a question around the use of technology as even wanting to have a debate about nuclear power. I mean, even environmentalists, the great James Lovelock, who I'm quite an admirer of, and he was a true scientist, he really wanted to understand, and he even ended up advocating against a lot of environmentalists' nuclear power. But why? Not because he thought it was a good thing. And you don't have to be an alarmist about nuclear weaponry to understand that nuclear waste is a burden on future generations. Chernobyl, that could be a one-word answer to why not have nuclear power as such. But it's not even the ultimate solution, because you are depriving people, you are putting people into false sense of security about them being able to have their cake and eat it. But you can have a debate, ultimately, about the use and abuse of technology and whether it is the solution. So that's a question about probability. I think environmentalists should be very open to that. James Lovelock did advocate nuclear power with a heavy heart for the sole reason that he felt, probably understanding human nature and our inability to get out of our ways, precisely because he needed to buy us time.
Thank you, thank you. Orsolya.
Okay, so I'm a communication specialist, rather not reflecting on technology because we would be in trouble. However, we touched upon the human perspective of this issue. And climate change has really become a generational issue. The Gen Z is really into it. And I have lectures at the university and talking to people who are just 5 years younger than me. And I'm facing with the fact that they are really anxious. There is statistics about it all over the world. And I'm usually talking to them about this topic. So they are really anxious. They don't dare think anything because they hear it from the media. And they don't want to have children because they are afraid that their children won't have a future. So I think we should put people first in this whole issue and then all the others.
Thank you very much.
So it's the first question about electric vehicles. The problem with diesel and petrol cars is the tailpipe emissions are killing people today. So if you can replace it with something that may cause a problem tomorrow, I still think that's therefore a good decision. Yes, the lithium mines can be in conflict zones, but again, we're better as a society at not allowing that as much as we used to. We must try harder, it's the only thing I would say there. To my Siemens friend, I'm a big fan of energy to waste. It's not difficult to collect waste streams across London or any big city in the world. Just buy a copy of the book and there's 2 chapters on waste that will answer all of those questions. But what I would say about our turbines is that they are, all parts are refurbished, recycled, reused, all returned to the system, and they're designed with software from their inception to ensure that they go cradle to cradle in their existence. So nothing goes as plastic waste into oceans or into landfill or into any kind of incineration. Somebody talked about something else. Oh yeah, I'll just make a comment on the humans. We are 0.4% of life on Earth. We're actually lower than that if you include other wider definitions. But the only thing I would say here is if we have the power to destroy, we have therefore the responsibility to protect, and perhaps that's what being human is. And that's
very good, very good. All right. Right. I'm going to come, I've really messed up the time, but I'm going to come out for a very, very quick show of hands. So, okay, please.
Kerry from the World Right film crew. Just quickly, first, brilliant to be at a conference where question everything, ban nothing is the order of the day. And given we now live under the regime of Charles the Terrible and environmentalism is so mainstream, thank goodness there are events like this where at least young people once a year can hear something different. I wanted to ask the panel, what are your views, which relates to the man and the dial question, on global greening? Because it is real, but it's not allowed to be talked about or discussed in terms of CO2 and plant life. Secondly, has the energy crisis, in your view, begun to make more people perhaps even question some of the anti-human consequences, whatever your intentions are, of the fact that we have stalled what we need in terms of energy production for so long? And thirdly, I have to just say, you know, saying that climate change is responsible for the flooding and death in Pakistan is an outrage. You know, I think how dare anybody not see the poverty and underdevelopment that means in Pakistan people drown and elsewhere in the world they don't. That's an outrage.
All right, thank you very much.
There's been a bit of talk about what we as individuals can do, like turn the thermostat down, grow your own vegetables. But where I struggle a bit with this is what about the people who make the laws and the rules, so the politicians who set the targets? because I don't see them curtailing their lives. They fly around on private jets, and this policy, it seems very much a case of telling us to curtail ourselves. Don't have children. Don't do this. Don't drive a car. And if you must, then drive an electric car, as if, you know, who can afford that? It just seems a little bit peasant, know your place.
Very good.
Just to the point about the floods, you know, and referring to the science, you know, the IPCC's reports are the gold standard. I'm sure you'll all agree. And they say that there is low confidence regarding any sign of global trends in frequency of floods. They say the same thing for droughts, small-scale weather like hail and thunderstorms, and for cyclones. So if that's what AR5 and AR6 say, why are you saying, and actually one other thing, the World Meteorological Organization says that given the current state of science, it's impossible to actually attribute a single weather event, and weather and climate are very different things, to climate change. So, you know, you may be trying to generate, people to act about global warming, which I agree is real and we need to do something about. And as the guy here said, you know, we need to move in a steady pace towards eliminating it. But by catastrophizing, I think you actually damage the cause rather than help it.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. All right. That's your lot. I mean, I think the lady there, I mean, for me, a very interesting question in terms of who's being told to do what and who's not doing it. You know, when you watch the Al Gore movie and watch Al Gore flying around the world to tell us all not to fly around the world, it does kind of ring a little bit hollow. And then you see Extinction Rebellion, you read Extinction Rebellion's website, they tell you that they only need 3.5% of the population to be convinced of environmentalism, because that's the tipping point to be able to change political direction. You realize it's not a democratic movement. It's about an imposition by a minority. So there's something interesting about, you know, almost like a red wall conversation about people in elites telling us to behave differently while they carry on swanning around in their chauffeur-driven cars. But anyway, we're going to go in reverse order. Yeah, so you finished. So, Nico.
Okay, so talking about solutions, when we talk about freedom, it's not a luxury discussion that we do over a drink. Freedom is an existential need to face any crisis. And we talked about electric cars. If industry all these years was not bound so much by regulations and all these limits, I think we would have arrived at electric cars decades ago. How do I know? Because the industries that are free, relatively free to operate without much limit, such as this industry, has given us miracles. Imagine if we had the same in energy, in transportation, and most importantly, in medicine. But that's for another discussion. So freedom is the solution. It's not just something that we say. It's the most moral and the most practical thing.
Very punchy. Good. Shahrar.
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to say that authoritative scientists are claiming that you won't get more extreme weather events, and they're talking about weather events. Just in the same way that we can talk about the hottest decade on record, you will get more extreme scenarios. So that's what I was pointing out in terms of Pakistan. You know, the anger you might rightly feel around bad policy, bad infrastructure, is not misdirected as such, but that's not the cause of the flooding. That is a question of better adaptation and people being able to have the resource to do that, even though they might be least responsible for being on the receiving end of it. I'm just going to finally talk about sources of moral value, which is an important question. I don't believe, and I think when you think of it, you know, many of us will have companion animals. I don't think it's true to say that we are the source, unique source of value in the world. I think that's incredibly anthropocentric, egotistic view to take. It's a bit like saying that we don't care and nobody should give a damn about a dead planet simply because we're not on it either. I think we do give a damn about a dead planet and all the untold extraordinary species that we share this beautiful planet with, and we're not even prepared or shouldn't be so confirmed in our view that we are the highest species in the land. I don't think that's clear at all. Other species are able to communicate, to experience and feel emotion. They are sentient, and they are worthy of respect, and they have moral consideration behind them. So, if anything, environmentalists don't just pit human beings as the be-all and end-all. You're right about that, but it isn't a dichotomy. We understand that life as such is precious, and all those perspectives on life, not just the human beings, are worth preserving. And if that doesn't add to the weightiness of the claim upon us, I don't know what will.
Thank you very much. That opens a new conversation, doesn't it? Right at this last moment. And for those people out there, if you take a look at, as Orsolya was saying, take a look at the ecocide discussions that are going on about sentience within bills and acts that are going through Parliament. It's quite remarkable, kind of following on from what you're saying. Anyway, Orsolya.
So just very quickly, the lady mentioned the energy crisis. As it broke out, a lot of followers has left these campaigns, for example, the Extinction Rebellion, because it is just unbearable for the human mind to live in this type of crisis. And secondly, the other lady mentioned flying around the world. I think that too much pressure is put on the individuals in general. We should provide solutions and help for the people, not just saying them, okay, you are in a catastrophe, go home, change your life. That doesn't lead to anything, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. I'm really pleased you raised global greening. So the lady over there. If everyone planted a tree on the planet, there's two problems with that statement. Firstly, they won't. But secondly, even if they did, it would make such a negligible difference. Unfortunately, it wouldn't have such a great impact. However, we could get governments to stop chopping down forests on a big scale and do more to protect them, and also industrial scale geoengineering projects like putting algae systems in the Antarctic and other things like that would make a difference. But actually the root of the problem is stopping adding CO2 to the atmosphere. And I think we have to be pragmatic about greening, but you're right, we have to begin that discussion, do more about it, get people to connect more to nature, because I do think that would actually be helpful. And then to the gentleman, amazing, your IPCC comment. What I think you were doing was confirming mine was the leading argument of the panel. So thank you. You're a very wise man. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for the panel.